welcome back, guys. Today's Wednesday. This is April the 2nd, and it is day 7 of NTI. Today we're going to talk about two more mental illnesses, bipolar and PTSD. So let's get right to it. Bipolar. It used to be called manic depression. Your grandparents might even call it manic depression. That name got changed about 40 years ago. Manic depression, a lot of times people would get confused. They would hear the word manic depression and they would think, oh man, that person is just really depressed. Well, they didn't understand the word manic. Manic means high, depression means low, okay? But they said that's a confusing term, so let's change it to bipolar. So what is bipolar? And who gets this? Well, we don't necessarily know who gets it, but we do know that there is, in terms of certain types of family history, genetics has a higher rate. Who is typically diagnosed? Around 25 to 30 years of age. That's when people typically get diagnosed. About 1 to 3% of the population, which then would come out to be about 6 million Americans. So what is it and what types? Well, we got two types, all right? And they're simply called type 1 and type 2, all right? Type 1, type 2. And if this was our baseline, most of us have normal moods, okay? All right, so that brown strip would be our baseline. Yeah, we all have a little bit of high days, a little bit of low days, all right? But for the most part, we're all going to be here for the most part, all right? But for somebody that is bipolar and type 1, they're going to have more extremes, more extreme highs, more extreme lows. So their moods might go like this, down to here, okay? That would be type 1. Extreme highs, extreme lows. Extremely dangerous, okay? Not only are the lows dangerous, but the highs are dangerous. You know, somebody might be doing a lot of risky behavior, whether it's riding a convertible with the top off, going down the freeway, you know, standing up. Really risky, okay? It's not just even the risky behaviors of jumping out of an airplane or bungee jumping. That's not even what we're talking about, but they might even want to do that type of stuff. You still can have a lot of chances of death in this manic phase, okay? Everybody always thinks of, ooh, depression, suicide in this phase. Well, this is just as dangerous as this phase for type 1, okay? Type 2, these are the type of people, they typically will be in depression phase longer than they are in manic phases. And their extremes aren't anywhere as high. So they might be here, stay in a depression phase for a longer period of time, come up here, but then that low isn't quite as low, okay? But they stay in that depression phase a little bit longer. And the reason why it's hard to medicate somebody like this, a doctor doesn't try to give you depressants or antidepressants depending on what he or she thinks that your next mood is. That's not what they try to do. They just try to give you mood stabilizers to keep you around this baseline like most of us. They're not going to guess when you're going to go in what phase because you can't guess. Some of these phases might be hours, it could be days, it could be weeks. We just don't know, all right? All right, so let's explain this a little bit more. Why does bipolar occur? I want you to think about two parts of the brain, okay? The frontal lobe controls decision making, right? And then we have inside our temporal lobes, part of our brain called your amygdala, and that controls your feelings of excitement, okay? So if the amygdala is super hot, it's on fire, okay? You might be in that manic phase, especially if your frontal lobe is turned down, essentially, okay? Like a volume switch on a radio, all right? So if the volume's low or the frontal lobe is low, it's not very active, but your amygdala is active, that person is doing a lot of risky behaviors, okay? But then with bipolar, it can easily switch at any point. So let's say somebody goes with the amygdala, is not very stimulated at all, it's low, and your frontal lobe is on fire, okay? Dr. Sanji from CNN, he did a great job of explaining this. I watched him on a report one time, and he was like, picture a car and brakes. If your frontal lobe was the brakes, okay, and it was applied really hard, okay, you're not going anywhere. This person might not even want to get out of bed, all right, in the morning. this person would be in that depression phase. All right, so it's a constant battle between your amygdala and your frontal lobe. Right? So for most of us, we're fine. We have an even balance. But for somebody that's bipolar, that's a little bit more difficult. Next thing we're going to talk about, PTSD. Most of you understand PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress disorder is when you relive an event, okay? Relive a horrific event, and it's a flashback. Well, here's the difference between a flashback and a memory. A flashback is I'm actually going to feel it, okay? My hands might start sweating. My heart rate is going to be elevated. My breathing is going to be elevated. I'm actually going to feel like I'm back in that same situation as I was previously. Compared to a memory, you might have walked up on stage, tripped, fell, embarrassed yourself, and if somebody would remind you that a couple of years later, oh yeah, I remember, and you might not like it, but there's a huge difference between a memory and actually a flashback, okay? And PTSD is a flashback and requires a trigger. Well, what's a trigger? Well, if I was a war veteran, I might be filling up my gasoline here in northern Kentucky, but I would smell diesel fuel. And if I smell diesel fuel, then maybe it reminds me of that combat mission, and I start having those same physical symptoms, okay, as when I was in the war. So you might hear that war veterans hate fireworks, okay? That sudden, loud explosion, might be a trigger going back to them. Speaking of veterans, war veterans, we didn't even know anything about PTSD. We didn't even think it even existed, okay, until back in Vietnam. When our war veterans were coming back from Vietnam, people were like, something's wrong. Our guys are just not quite right as compared to when they went over beforehand. And so we kind of thought that about 1 out of every 9 war veterans were diagnosed with this PTSD stuff. We actually know that number was probably quite off. It's probably more 1 out of every 4 or every 5. So in our test, our notes, we're going to go with the stat of 1 out of every 5 people that serve in the war oftentimes come back with PTSD. But there's a grade that's even higher, and this is about 1 out of every 4. And it's sexual assaults or rape victims. They are our highest demographic, okay? So please keep that in your mind, write down in your notes, okay? Sexual assault, rape victims, highest rate for PTSD. A lot of therapy is going on with PTSD. And 60 Minutes did a great job documenting this. And it's a documentary. It's called 60 Minutes Advanced PTSD Therapy. If you want to watch it, it's pretty strong. It's pretty good. But in that therapy, they talk about something that they're kind of doing, especially in VA hospitals, and it's called prolonged exposure. And what they're doing is having people constantly talk. About 3 to 5 times a day, they explain what they went through. And because the more you talk about something, whether you're talking to a counselor, a psychiatrist, or whatever, it's oftentimes better. But a lot of times when something horrific happens to somebody, we don't want to talk about it. And a lot of times people don't want to bring it up. They think, oh, if we bring it up, they'll get sad, they'll get lonely, get depressed. Okay, that's not the case. The more you talk about, the better it'll be. And if you don't have a psychiatrist, counselor, whatever, find a loved one, someone that you can trust, and just talk if something horrific did happen to you with it. But I strongly recommend you watching it if you have time. So videos are going to keep on being short. Now, the one thing I wanted you to understand, I'm not going to do a video for the next 2 days. So Thursday, which is tomorrow, day 8, I'll just leave notes and you can watch the videos that correspond with it about depression and about eating disorders. Again, both mental illnesses, depression and eating disorders. And then on Friday, which was day 9 of our NTI, I want you to take a test, and it's going to be on Google Forms. Go ahead and do the test, and you'll get the results back instantaneously, and I'll get the results instantaneously, and we'll go from there. So I hope everybody's doing well, and make sure that you guys look in your Google Classroom for the next 2 days. Depression, eating disorders tomorrow, test on Friday. Take care. Miss you guys. Bye.